Hey there, Tony here from Chronical Studios. In this devlog series, I chronicle my journey as an indie solo developer creating a stealth roguelike game in Unreal called Shadow Rasa. In this video, we'll be going over the completed damage system, why I chose to go with a different analytics provider, how I set up the ragdoll physics for guards, and why I reinstalled my operating system. The circle and the square damage effects are working now, and I've implemented a ragdoll system to make the disintegration effect look really cool. The box effect wasn't as complicated to implement since I had figured out a lot of the core functionality when I created the circle radius damage. There were a few tricky bits to figure out though, so I created this box collider that would just repeatedly do damage to the player so that I could make sure that the correct box orientation would be applied and the damage would come through correctly. The main problem I had to solve that was different than the circle radius was figuring out if a specific particle was inside the damage box. For a sphere, it's pretty easy. You can just take the radius, or the difference between the hit point and the particle point, and see if the length of that is less than the radius of a circle, the circle of the damage. But for a box, you can't easily just take the length and figure out if you're within the extents, because like in this example where it's rotated, you can see that if I was just checking the y value actually changes as you go down, and it changes on the x when it's rotated. So it's not just as simple as doing that, and I wanted something that was pretty performant, so there's a few things I had to do to figure out how to do that. What I ended up doing was applying the inverse rotation to the point from the center of the hitbox to the particle, which essentially took it from its original orientation and made it so that the x and y component of it could be checked against the box x and y extents to tell if it was inside that box. This would still require me to do 6 checks, since this point here, which has an x and y coordinate relative to this center, I'd have to check if the x and y were within these bounds. So if this was 100 and this was negative 100, then I'd have to do an if greater than the negative 100 and less than this, then it's within this bounds. And then I'd do the same for this. So if this was 50 and negative 50, I'd have to do another one for that. And there's also the z coordinate, which I'm not showing here. So in total, we'd have 6 checks just to see if that were within this box extent, which isn't really great inside a shader, or more specifically the shader HLSL code that can be put into Niagara scratch pads. We can actually get around this by taking the absolute value of the various floats inside this vector that makes up this point. So let's say we had a point down here that was negative 50, negative 50. If we took the exact absolute value of it, it would actually flip it so that it was back into the positive space. Same goes for here. If we had something that was negative on the x, it would get flipped over here. If we had something negative on the y, it'd get flipped over here. And effectively what we have is stuff that's only in the positive space and can't go into the negative, because anything negative would have been pushed over to here. Then all we have to do is take these same coordinates, x, y, and z, and then just check against their corresponding extents. So here it would be 50, here it would be 100, and that right there just eliminates half of our checks, so we don't have to worry about any of these bounds. This could actually be taken one step further by first normalizing this vector by dividing it by its extent to get a normalized value, which will give us a 0 here if you're at the origin and a 1 if you're right at the extent for the y. And also, if you do it for the x, you'll get a 0 here if it was right at the origin, and a 1 if you're right at the extent. Anything greater than the extents will actually be higher than 1. So what we do is we do the normalization, which is just taking its value and dividing it by the extent. So in here it's 50 divided by the 100, which makes this 0.5 halfway. So that's how you normalize. You just do it for the x, y, and z. Then once you have that, what you can do is take the maximum of all the x, y, and z's, because we're only really interested in the one that's the largest. If the largest is bigger than the extents, then we're outside the box. If it's the largest is within, then they're all within. And that basically gives us a way to have one if condition for it, the same way we had our radius check. So if the maximum is less than 1, then we're in the box, and then we have our else for outside the box. And the logic for the rest of the logic for the circle, like the same code that I wrote for the circle radius damage, applies for this. So I use that same check, I apply the same logic, and then everything else down the pipe works exactly how it should. This is the kind of fun problem I like to solve while coding, using just math to simplify everything down to a single if statement like the radius. One other thing that I did was set it up so that there was actually a scale value that would make the box bigger than its original extent, so that the original extent would be solid right at the beginning, and then the other parts would fade out as the damage was applied. This was done using a bit of extra logic, using the radius as an input to know how far out the box would extend, and then doing a little bit of extra logic here to basically make it fade out away from the box from there. So that was a kind of a neat thing that I also set up to give the radius effect the same way that the circle damage kind of had a gradient radius out. After creating the death effect, I ran into this issue where a moving guard character wouldn't always spawn all the particles like you just saw there. What would sometimes happen is only part of the particles would spawn, and you wouldn't see the actual full dismantling like that. So I actually added that effect that you just saw there, a highlight, when it doesn't fully occur. Well, actually it always happens, you just only see it when it doesn't fully occur. But what this gives me is the ability to have an alternate way for characters to die, and to use it periodically. 90% of the time I'll mini use this effect when I can. When it's close, because it's really cool, and I've tied it into a ragdoll system, which kind of kicks you around there, but which lets you do kind of cool things like kick the character and move where the particles go. So I'm going to try to do that 90% of the time, but every once in a while I'll use an alternate death effect, and I'll also use it when I'm over budget. So if too much is happening on the screen and the FPS could drop, what I'll do is switch over to that alternate death method so that I can keep the performance up. I can also use it as an accessibility option if for whatever reason you don't want to use the particles, or if you're using a computer that's spec lower than the requirements for this specific game. So there's actually a few good reasons to have it, and what I might ultimately do to fix the particle system is break it up, because there's actually a damage component and the death, spread, and physics-based component of it. So if I split those into two and activate and deactivate them, then that could help me with the performance as well. But in the meantime, this is what I'm going to do until I get back to that system and start working on it again. Standard method for damage to get to a guard or enemy is for the ability itself to first, do whatever it's going to do to find a hit. So in this case, the pistol does a line trace. If it hits something, then it checks to see if it's a gas character, which is the gameplay ability system character. If it is, then it just applies that visual damage to that character. If it isn't, then I actually had to set up a special interface for damageable actors, and then check if it was one of those. This mainly is for the instance where you have a character with a head, which is a different part, that needs to redirect its damage down to the base body. Otherwise, the part would get the event, not the player itself. So first thing I do is try to cast it to a character. If that doesn't work, then I see if there's a damageable actor. If it is, then I apply the visual to that instead, the visual damage. So for the heads, they're all based off of the damageable actor, which implements an interface that lets me send data to it, and then all this thing does is redirect it. So when this head is spawned and added to the guard, it sets the parent so that the head knows what its parent is, and then whenever these visual events come in, I just do a validated get and then just pass it along through. So I had to set that up in C++, just so that my gas character could implement it, and the damageable actors as well could implement it, and then I could just send a damage event to either, really. But that lets me specify a few things as well, because one of the other things I can do with this system is over here I could eventually add a type, so I could know this is head, and then maybe amplify the damage or do different things like that. So in the case of, let's say, like a drone character, the drone character could actually have different parts on it, antennas or arms or what have you, and maybe you can blow those off, or maybe some of those are more vulnerable or tougher. So that's where I can do these checks to apply different visual damages or different things at that point. With this system in place, I was able to add square damage to the dagger by having this collider be passed in through the visual apply damage when the dagger primary was hit. So when the overlapped event occurred, this event comes through, it grabs the box collider and applies that visual damage. As you can see in this demonstration, when I stab a guard, you'll actually see the square damage appear in different locations, and when I kill them, they go into ragdoll and you can kick them and have some really cool disintegration effects. One of the other things that's been on my to-do list was to look into an error I was getting with the analytics server since it wasn't able to connect and kept having problems. I was using dev to dev, and when I first set it up, everything was working perfectly. Originally what I thought the issue was I wasn't up to date with the latest plugin, so I looked through and tried to find the Git repository and see if there was a later version, which there was, and I went through all the methods of installing it and setting it up properly, and it still wasn't connecting correctly. So I didn't really want to fight with it a bunch, and I had researched a few different possibilities previously, and one of them was the Microsoft PlayFab analytics package. It also has a bunch of other things that you can do with it, like leaderboards and things like that. I don't really recall the reason why I didn't want to use it, but I decided to go back that direction to see if that would be a better way to go. After very little work, I was able to get it up and running, and giving me telemetry on the game, so that worked really well. I didn't get any errors. There actually also had the added benefit of, well, leaderboards. I could also log in anonymously, which is actually really good. You can feed it a unique ID, save it locally, and then just have the character or player always connect using the same ID, and so if they post stuff to a leaderboard or anything like that, it stays unified. They'll lose it if they reinstall, but it's a good way to just have a easy connection and not a lot of login and extra stuff on top, which a lot of players don't like. Which also has the added advantage of working through consoles and other things where I don't necessarily want to log in, because the PlayFab actually has a way to log in using Steam. So since this is going to be a Steam game mainly as my initial release, I'll be able to utilize that to log in and have a unique ID that way. But for other things like consoles or anywhere else I want to put it that doesn't have a unique ID, I can use that anonymous setting, which will work really well for me. One other really cool thing I was able to implement over the last 2 weeks was the ragdoll system. It was pretty easy to set up. All I had to do was create a physical body that mimicked the body of the guard, and set up some of the constraints so that it acted more naturally. Once that was done, all I really had to do was enable it on the enemy when the death effect occurred, which would basically be just a matter of toggling, let's see here, toggling the physics, set simulated physics on the mesh itself. So once that was done at a specific point in the sequence, they would basically just collapse, and then you could kick them. And the really cool thing is that the velocity of the various parts were imparted onto the particles, which would cause a really cool effect. As you can see here, when you kill the character, you can actually push them and kick them. I didn't do it fast enough. You can push them and kick them to move their bodies, and then those movements get imparted onto the particles as they go and spreads them out in really cool effects. It also kicks these characters around a bit if they're too close, and it can actually kick them right out of the level sometimes. So I did adjust the mask settings a bit to help with that, but there's a bit more that needs to be done. I think there might be a way for me to make it so the colliders are specific, but I like how the body just kind of flops and then the particles just spread out like that. It leads to some really neat effects when you kill people. So it's really, really cool. I like it. I had an error in my build log for a while that my .NET libraries were vulnerable and needed updating. I decided to try to tackle that issue, but it did not go well. I was originally using Visual Studio Enterprise on trial, but the trial ran out, so I moved on to Community. This was a few months back before I started getting the .NET error. I'd been using the JetBrains Rider IDE instead of Visual Studio for a long time, but Visual Studio would still need updates from time to time, so I'd go in and do them. I tried reinstalling .NET from the Microsoft Direct installs and from the Community installer, but regardless of what I did, either the build in Unreal wouldn't work or it would just go back to the same error. Eventually I realized I had to install the exact version that Unreal suggested for 5.3, but since you could only get the previous versions of Visual Studio for Pro and Enterprise, I thought I had to go with Community. In the end, I installed the Pro version of Visual Studio that Unreal wanted and just didn't open it, which ultimately fixed the issue, but it required me to reinstall my operating system because I thought that was part of the issue. It needed it anyways. It'd been a long time, but it was just a nightmare of a couple of days to fix this very simple problem of upgrading .NET. Fun times. I'm actually in a really good place right now, and I'm going to be doing a big push to get my store page out. My goal is to actually get the store page out by hopefully the end of December, but worst case it'll be early January, the first week of January, that I'll get it up. I definitely wanted it up a lot sooner, but I mean, there's been a lot of little things that have been slowing me down, specifically this particle system, but I really like how it's turned out, so I think it was worth it. It's going to be really cool. I'll have to fix that bound box. But in the meantime, what I'm going to do is I'm still going to release my weekly newsletter and keep you guys up to date that way, because it's pretty easy for me to do that. But and also I'm going to probably do my video shorts on Wednesdays, just because they're also pretty easy to put together, and then leave these long form videos for maybe once a month, because I really got to like hunker down and get this store page out, then the demo out, and then the full release. So I think that schedule will work best for me, and I'll still be able to get you guys updates on how everything's going. That's all for today. Be sure to like and subscribe or join our newsletter using the link below. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.